All right. I'm really happy to be online with Shannon Lietz. And if you've been part of DevSecOps, DevOps, and Skill Up Days, or just watched, some of the LinkedIn learning videos about DevSecOps, you'll know Shannon's name. And so, Shannon, I thank you for agreeing to, be online with me.
Oh, absolutely. So glad to be here.
Cool. Well, as a CISO, I've got an elevator speech about DevSecOps, and I'm using it. I don't know it's entirely effective. So if you were doing a kind of an elevator speech pitching DevSecOps to development, maybe to the CISO or to somebody, I guess, what would your elevator speech be like?
Quite often I've pitched it as software safer sooner. So one tagline, and it's a cultural transformation along with a tooling transformation to get security and trust into the software development pipeline.
Yeah, I think early on, the research I focused on a lot was Jez Humble's research, and there was an early study that Gene Kim was part of, the IT Process Institute, and they actually set the stage, I thought, for showing that with the practices of DevSecOps, you actually got better productivity in terms of throughput. Um,
Yep.
and is that something you've seen kind of borne out, in the practice as you've seen it implemented?
Yeah, absolutely. I think productivity has increased quite a bit. And when you look at how people work, security practitioners that are coding are definitely more effective and they're able to get to more things. So if you think about the attack surface, it's never getting smaller. Usually it's always growing. People are trying to do more things with technical capabilities. And you kind of look at the development side of the house, and when they don't have to worry about compliance being added on, and they're not having to think about it twice, they're not having to refactor their code when something gets missed, you
Right.
essentially see productivity gain.
So for a CISO starting out, or just whomever, it could be anybody in IT or wherever, and they want to start DevSecOps practices, just ground zero. Like I think I said in an email before this, I'm asking for a friend. Just kind of ground zero. You're walking into a new place, and kind of how would you kind of advise people to start?
Yeah, a good starting place for DevSecOps is to get a sense of what you're developing in terms of products and services and figuring out how many of those products and services that you have in terms of a asset pipeline. So, first of all, you got to know what you have, and then to essentially assess how much of that is exploitable. So what things like CVEs are out there, how much do you have to be concerned about what's being built? And then I think the final part of that, beginning scenario, probably your first 90 days, is figuring out what you're going to do in terms of pressure testing it. How many adversaries do you have? What do you have even the products to be able to answer some of those questions? Over the years, I'd say I started out with DevSecOps where there wasn't really a book for it, if you will. And I think when we got to the point where we started measuring more effectively, I can now give guidance to most CISOs to say, you really should be testing your products, services, your entire ecosystem, if you will, and using a metric like a securability or something else that you might have to turn security more into something that you can drive through goals and measurement.
Yeah, and I think part of my focus, and this is sometimes where we wound up going around in circles in the past, was kind of the educating the developers, you know, talking to them about, well, shift left, I'm going to move a lot of this responsibility to you, and they're like I don't have enough work to do already. So
Yeah.
approaching the development community, I guess, how would you recommend people start to approach the development leadership and even the developers in terms of education process?
Yeah, I think there's still some controversy about how to help developers to take on that charge of software safer sooner. And what I would recommend is to de-jargon the security conversation.
Right.
So, what is the work of a developer that you're asking them to do? And essentially, if you look at like the OWASP top 10, essentially you're asking for folks to work on several key areas like input validation. And when you really approach them with, hey, you have input validation errors versus cross-site scripting, XXE, SQL injection, and you're educating them on the benefits of input validation, that can make it so much more accessible. I think we have to start to de-jargon and make security accessible as leaders in the industry. Otherwise, trying to get developers to do more and become security experts, I think that's not necessarily going to be proactive enough for most organizations. It's not going to be fast enough.
Right.
And ultimately, going to lose the war.
Yeah, I remember getting some blank stares when I started going, "Hey, do you use trunk or branch?" And they're like, "Why is the security guy talking to me about trunk?" So it was just kind of a funny discussion. So, any particular sets of tools that people start with in terms of, let's just pretend that you have a CISO and he has almost no budget, like any kind of open source tools, pretty good.
Yeah. What's interesting is GitHub bought Semel, and they do a bunch of capabilities. So if you have no tools, you might be able to leverage some of their capabilities, depending on whether you use GitHub or GitLab or some of those. There's a bunch of free capabilities out there. I know that SNCC has capabilities for open source to be able to look at those trends and practices. They also share a lot of information about what exploits are out there, as well as the CVEs. They do a lot in this industry to try and raise the water level and all boats that go with it. So when dealing with the adversary war, I would say there's a tremendous amount of tools out there, and the community itself has really been trying to up level in terms of what's available. So there's a lot of community editions that are available to you.
Right.
It's really about where are the problems that you're trying to solve, and then trying to find the one or two tools that you could start with. I still think that focusing in on getting a sense of what's getting escaped is probably the easiest way to have the conversation about, hey, I found this escape, I really need help to fix it. And then enlisting your development folks to figure out how to fix the things that are coming out at the other end of the pipeline.
Right. So in terms of even pushback from, well, we can talk about internal audit. That could be a whole nother session, perhaps.
That could be another session.
Although I would think really with the automation, configuration management, and the auditability, this would be potentially an auditor's dream, because everything's documented and you can provide evidence fairly easily in terms of, I'll use the dreaded word attestation, right? So like security education, do you typically see people, as you shift those controls into the actual software pipelines, so the changing the participation of security to kind of almost the auditor role, but also from a maybe like threat modeling point of view, do you typically see people get involved in STRIDE and other techniques like that?
Yeah, I do see lots of folks that are going after threat modeling as part of predicting what adversaries will take advantage of so that they can also focus their time. It becomes a great prioritization tool in that sense. I think there's another strategy too, which is attack mapping. So taking an attack surface perspective and figuring out what adversaries might be keen on. That can also be helpful because it takes not just the defender's perspective, but the adversary's perspective. And I see that developers are very interested in trying to figure out how they're going to understand an adversary so that they can put in the right defense versus trying to figure out how to build the right defense for any sort of threat or any sort of adversary attack.
Right, and that could be where some of the risk analysis from security should come in if you're building threat actor libraries and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So as people get better at this, or let's say you get the toehold, what would you think like a kind of a really good DevSecOps practice would look like? In terms of your SAST, DAST, IASP, RASP. And the IDE integration. In fact, I'm really interested in the IDE integration just because had some problems there with performance, but in terms of the tools, what do you see people cool?
I see a lot of folks that are going after all of these different ways to assess their code, which is fantastic. there isn't one right way. I think there's a lot of folks that are trying to figure out how do they find the most important issues to deal with.
Right.
And finding can take time too. So one area I would say that's really new and why I'm keen on SEML is if you look at some of the approach that has been done by Fabs at Shift Left, he's been doing code graphing for quite some time, and he's got a open source project called Jorn, and some of their capability in Ocular is really interesting to find exploitable weaknesses, and it's not as hard or difficult doing so. So I'd say that's probably next generation and very interesting.
So typically, do you see, so one of the things I'm particularly interested in is getting to instrumentation and chat ops. So we get kind of more of the real-time or near real-time feedback to the developers. Is that typically, probably not cutting edge, but it's certainly something I haven't seen too many people do. Is that a pretty typical practice also?
Chat ops is awesome. I think, some of these tools like that Atlassian has and Slack has around making it so that you can put more information into people's hands and communicate with them does help break down barriers because, to your point about trunk or branch, having the conversation, having that debate, having the open dialogue, again, it's really about trying to win the war against adversaries, not each other. And I think that's a critical point to make when you're trying to solve for an organization. There's nothing that's going to be perfect. So how do you get to best? And I think getting to best is the best we can all do.
Yeah. We tend to aim for perfect, right? We read all of the standards, and we have to check all of the boxes, and the answer is you never check them all off at once, and you got to pick the low hanging fruit. So would you typically? Huh?
That's a collaboration too, right?
It should be. I think maybe that's the part that excites me about the whole thing is getting involved with the developers other than, hey, I scanned your stuff and here's your 487-page PDF document of all the things you need to fix.
Mm-hmm.
And I might be guilty of that in the past. So thinking of hurdles, I kind of call this hurdles and swamps. And this is just kind of part of operating in any company. Anytime there's more than one person in a room, there's going to be hurdles and things. And where are the typical places that you see DevSecOps or even DevOps? The raising of the maturity of your development processes and capabilities. The kinds of hurdles that people hit, and where do things typically, where do they go to die?
Yeah, the typical breakdown is believing that one side or the other owns the security problem. Both sides own the security problem. And I think when DevOps are, in a hurry, I think you can see speed problems. You can see some challenges there. So most problems do then get kind of sidetracked, and people end up not being able to move with speed and agility. And I think that's where I see the most friction and the most pain points is whenever somebody wants it their way and they're not willing to collaborate. It's the lack of collaboration that causes the challenges to come out in trying to put good software together.
So let's say, for example, you had a development team, you're approaching them and you're like, hey, I want to talk about DevSecOps. And they're like, yeah, but we're not even doing DevOps. And that seems like you're kind of like the whole thing is kind of DOA at that point.
It's really rare to find a company that's still doing waterfall. So I would say that while most people think they're not doing DevOps, it's very interesting to me because I've had these chats with different folks, and I would say it's a small percentage that are not doing DevOps these days. Most are, and they just don't necessarily realize it because to them, the ideal DevOps is what they measure themselves against, and they aren't measuring themselves on the bell curve, from one end to the other. In that way that's going to help them to see that they just might be on the low end of the bell curve on an early journey, that they may have not had a lot of capability at their disposal. They don't have the tools at their disposal. And I think that's actually what causes the beginning of the challenges is people don't really understand that they are in a DevOps environment, regardless of how they actually push to production. If they're pushing to production, 2 times a year, that doesn't necessarily mean they're doing waterfall. It just
Right.
means that their environment's different, right? And it could be that they're pushing to a staging environment 3 times a day, even in an environment where they only push to production twice a year. So I think there's a lot of different flavors to DevOps that are still emerging. And even in the early part or that part, it can be a challenge.
So somebody's interested, developers, CISOs, or yeah, anybody in terms of beginning to learn. I guess what kind of resources? Are there some organizations you'd recommend? I was particularly enamored when I went to the Skill Up Day about 2 months ago. So anything like that at all you could talk about?
I love the fact that so many companies are now sharing skills, right? Skill Up Days is awesome. ONUG is a favorite of mine. They are just coming and they're bringing so much virtual capability to the learning aspects of technology. All Day DevOps, can't say enough. I rave about them because honestly, they're my heroes. I'd also say DevSecOps Days is another great one. There's some folks across the country that are doing some great work too in the security communities where they're really bringing DevSecOps to life. Like I go to LastCon every year. They're awesome. And I think, what I'm inspired by is that even during COVID times, people are engaging and they're reaching across and learning and figuring out how they're going to solve for a virtual conference of thousands of people. That's pretty inspiring and wonderful to see.
Yeah, I
But
was
there's so many.
really happy. When I went to Skill Up Days, I wasn't sure, and I just started chatting with people, and people actually took time after the conference to meet with me, and um, it was surprising, and it was just an awesome, I don't know, experience because walking in and saying, hey, I'm a CISO and I'm just figuring this stuff out, and people were very encouraging. I don't know, that's not the right word, but
They were friendly. I mean,
yeah.
it's interesting to see how many more people want to learn. And my belief is that everybody's a hero. They bring something to you, and you need to be receptive to it. They might have a different perspective, they might push you. And I think, too, that the fact that people are teaching each other is allowing them to learn faster. So I love things like this because right now we're getting a chance to teach. And I think we have to see more people be courageous enough to teach and learn at the same time.
I think, well, even sometimes walking and admitting, well, I've read the book or I've done this or that, but I haven't seen it. I don't really know how this works in the real world. Being able to just talk to people and say, hey, I want to learn from you, from what you know. And
Yeah.
all right.
You know, it's real interesting too to see people progressing and to admit that they have things to learn. There are some additional tools to think about too. I was just thinking about that. Udemy is another one. Degreed has some capabilities for you to assess skills. And there's a variety of cloud stuff out there. Cloud Academy is a great one. I think that there's plenty for people to go after, and you can seek it at your own speed on your own time.
Yeah, it's an odd recommendation, but I really found LinkedIn Learning helpful. There's some excellent DevSecOps materials on there. So,
And leadership materials too, because some of our boundaries are through communication and accessibility, right? So I do think that there's some wonderful stuff on LinkedIn Learning. I think that we can't get enough storytelling and leadership into the community either. We need more of it.
awesome. So, if we started with the elevator speech, so if anybody's thinking about it and they just haven't committed to it yet, I guess what would your closing argument be with them?
My closing argument is it's going to take you by surprise, but you're probably already in it. And,
Yeah,
embrace change. I would say if you think you're not in it, you just don't necessarily know. And I think being educated and informed is part of the process.
awesome, cool. Thank you.
Thank
All right.
you.